Good morning, everyone. My name is Daniel DePetris. I'm a fellow at Defense Priorities, a think tank emphasizing and promoting realism and restraint in the foreign policy discourse. It's my pleasure and honor to welcome you all this morning to an event titled Assessing a Formal U.S. Saudi Alliance, which, of course, there's been reports consistently over the last several months that the United States has been working with the Saudis and the Israelis on what they call a mega deal, in essence, providing U.S. security guarantees to Saudi Arabia in exchange for Saudi recognition or Saudi normalization with the state of Israel. And the Biden administration has essentially pegged most of its Middle East policy on this so-called mega deal. So this is what we'll be discussing today with three very, very esteemed, knowledgeable panelists. The first is Will Waldorf. He's a professor at the Department of Politics and International Affairs at Wake Forest University, and he's also a senior fellow at Defense Priorities. He focuses primarily on international relations, U.S. foreign policy, and grand strategy. His most recent piece, Just Stay Out, the Saudi-Israeli Grand Bargain is no bargain for the United States, discusses this U.S.-Saudi mega deal and elaborates on the downsides and the ramifications. Next up, we have Rose Kalanick. Rose is the new director of the Middle East program here at Defense Priorities, where her research focuses on international security, coercive diplomacy, energy politics, and U.S. grand strategy. She authored the book Black Gold and Blackmail, which basically elaborates on how oil relates to grand strategy and priorities around the world. Last up, we have Jennifer Kavanaugh. She's the director of military analysis at Defense Priorities and has spent her career studying U.S. national security and defense policy, force structure, defense budgeting, the defense industrial base, military interventions around the world, pretty much everything you can expect. She recently wrote The Case Against Israeli-Saudi Normalization, which appeared in Foreign Affairs, I believe, a few weeks ago. So I want to welcome all three of you. I'm very glad to kick off this conversation. It's going to be a very interesting panel. I wanted to start out basically with a very simple but elemental question that I think all three of you are very well qualified to speak on. And that's, do you think the United States would benefit from participating in this so-called grand bargain? If so, why? If not, why not? Will, could you go first, kick us off, and then we'll go to Rose, and then Jennifer, you can back clean up.
Yes, great. Thank you, Dan, for moderating, and thank you to Defense Priorities for hosting this event. This is a really important topic right now and going forward. My general take on this deal is that U.S. officials and advocates of this grand bargain are getting the costs and benefits to the United States all wrong. To this end, the added benefits will be marginal at best to the United States, and the cost of the deal to the United States will be quite high, far higher than advocates expect. So my sort of general recommendation is the United States should stay out of the grand bargain. Basically, as we know, just real quickly, the deal would involve Saudi Arabia recognizing Israel in exchange for an irrevocable plan from Israel to create a Palestinian state. To grease the wheels of the deal or to make it happen here, the United States would establish a formal alliance with Saudi Arabia and most likely Israel. It would also build a uranium enrichment facility in Saudi Arabia to develop a Saudi domestic energy program that would be the first of its kind ever for the United States. It's never done one of these facilities abroad before for proliferation worries. U.S. officials tout these as cheap commitments with big payoffs. The defense pacts will apparently increase deterrence against Iran to the point that the United States will never be called upon to enforce or honor these security commitments. It'll be able to pivot from the region, and the deal will prevent Saudi drift, apparently, into some kind of Chinese orbit by requiring Riyadh to sort of cut several different ties to China in various ways. So again, I think the United States has these cost-benefit calculations all wrong. I'm going to focus here for just a few minutes on the cost side of the equation. In general, I think what advocates of the bargain miss is that the deal significantly unsettles the regional balance of power in ways that will likely fuel conflicts that could drag the United States in, perhaps even into a bigger war. I think there are two pathways this is most likely to happen. First, the grand bargain will seriously increase Iranian threat perceptions. International relations scholars find A lot of history shows that when the balance of power significantly tips against a given state, that state will scramble to redress the balance in ways that will increase the prospects for conflict and war. And that's basically what Iran's going to face here with the grand bargain. The strongest country on the face of the earth, the United States, establishing alliances with its two existential foes, Saudi Arabia and Israel, plus that great power, the United States, giving a nuclear enrichment program to one of those foes that brings it much closer to proliferation. Now, as I detail in my explainer, I think the enrichment facility is going to really fuel Iranian threat perceptions, in part because the Saudis have talked not just about domestic uses for nuclear energy, but they've also talked quite a bit about proliferation, and the Iranians know this. So in response, I think there's several things that Iran and its aligned proxies might do. First, I think Iran probably will take the next step in its nuclear program and develop nuclear weapons with the grand bargain. If that happens, Israel with Saudi support, will almost certainly take military action, which, as discussed in recent weeks, would be a serious escalation that will increase the chances of a major regional war. Iran has shown with its first ever missile strikes this year on Israel that it will respond militarily to that. And because of its new alliance commitments, the United States will be on the hook to essentially bail both Saudi Arabia and Israel out. So any idea that this is going to sort of lead to some kind of retrenchment from the region, I think is not very wise. We're more likely to be more deeply engaged. And then secondly, I think we could see an increase besides Iranian proliferation, right? I think we could see an increase in proxy attacks with the grand bargain. Again, especially if there's no Palestinian piece to it, which, as Jennifer can probably speak to some, and Rose as well, there's been some sort of backing off on that in terms of what the Saudis expect. And again, once that happens, U.S. forces, which have already been targeted significantly, would be targeted even more. And the United States will be in the midst of a bigger war. So the idea that we're going to be able to retrench, I think, from this is difficult to see, especially with the Iranian and proxy response. I think the grand bargain also creates a second potential pathway to conflict, this time sort of via Saudi and Israeli actions. Basically, I think the deal will provide a security blanket. In international relations, we call this moral hazard. It will provide a security blanket that is likely to make Saudi Arabia more reckless, perhaps in the region, especially in Yemen and Israel, and to continue to enable Israel's already ongoing recklessness in the region that we've seen. We've seen a lot of this sort of moral hazard, again, where the protection, this is again a common idea among international relations scholars, a lot of history here, but basically when a great power makes an alliance commitment to an especially insecure or revisionist state, the protection that commitment offers can lead the weaker patron to become aggressive in ways that hurts the United States. Again, we've seen a lot of this already since 10/7 with Israel. I don't think that the grand bargain will necessarily make moral hazard worse with Israel. It's pretty bad already. But what it will do, especially if there's a collective defense agreement with Israel, is it's going to make it more difficult for the United States to fix the pattern of moral hazard that's already at play right now. And that's not going to be good for U.S. national interest. As to Saudi Arabia, we've seen in the past that moral hazard has been a problem in its policy towards Yemen. A lot of the aggression there in 2015, for instance, was enabled in a sense by U.S. support. And basically, I think the Grand Bargain Defense Pact could, again, lead to renewed recklessness, again, perhaps in Yemen. And the United States has paid a price for all of this, right? This war in Yemen has helped strengthen the Houthis, who are now attacking U.S. ships in the Red Sea. So, again, the United States, once Saudi Arabia, Israel become more aggressive, will be on the hook again to bail them out. And so essentially, I think the cost of this are potentially very high. And I think for that reason, the United States basically needs to stay out of the Grand Bargain. And the United States, instead of tightening alliance relations, needs to consider ways to figure out how to loosen alliance relations with both Israel and Saudi Arabia moving forward. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Will. Rose, you're up.
Great. Thank you so much. So As to your question of whether the United States would benefit from this grand bargain and how big a benefit would the U.S. get, I'm going to look at it from the point of view of oil, because that has historically been the major reason why the United States has cared about Saudi Arabia really sort of at all, right? And from the perspective of oil, there are no benefits to having an alliance with Saudis, whether that alliance is informal as it currently is, or whether the alliance is formalized in this new relationship, this new grand bargain. And that's for two reasons. One, there's almost no threat to Saudi Arabia, right? Or let me put it this way. There's no threat that some country can come over and conquer Saudi Arabia the way that Iraq potentially threatened to do circa 1990, 1991 under Saddam Hussein. Okay, that threat's totally gone. Iraq is a much weaker state. Before that, the United States worried about the Soviet Union being an aggressive state and potentially somehow taking over Saudi production. That can't happen, okay? So first of all, the big threats that motivated that alliance are gone. The second point, markets are just remarkably adaptable. We have a huge cushion if something does happen to Saudi oil production through markets alone, but then also through strategic petroleum reserves that the United States and its allies have put together. Okay, so a good example of this, right? There are some threats against Saudi oil facilities. We saw one take place in about 5 years ago, almost exactly 5 years ago, when drones attacked the oil facilities at Abqaiq and Khurais. This is in September of 2019. The Houthis claimed responsibility. The U.S. is pretty sure it was Iran, so I'm going to go ahead and say it was Iran. So by destroying or attacking, damaging these facilities, they took out about 5.7 million barrels a day of production, which was about half of Saudi's production and roughly 5% of the global oil market, which is roughly 100 million barrels a day. Prices spiked by about 15% immediately because traders saw, the potential for future disruptions, decided to bid up prices, et cetera. But what actually ended up happening in the oil market was extremely underwhelming. Okay, so there was no oil actually taken off the market, right? Production was taken offline by half, but the Saudis had oil in storage that they just used. They used the inventories that they had to make up for those deliveries. So there was no actual disruption of deliveries to the market, first of all. Second of all, the Saudis fixed the damage and restored output within about 2 weeks. And within that same period of 2 weeks, prices essentially returned to normal. Okay, that's half of Saudi's production, right? So, sometimes people refer to that incident and talk about it as if, oh, this is a big warning shot, or, we need to look at this incident and worry about the threats to Saudi oil. I look at it and see like, wow, it's actually really easy to repair these facilities, okay? And the market just on its own can adapt. The second big part of this is that in addition to market adaptation and market inventories, there's a ginormous, that's the technical term, there's a ginormous amount of oil reserved by the United States and its allies in the IEA. So IEA stockpiles, members of the IEA are basically the United States and its allies. They're required to hold at least 90 days of imports in stock at all times. IEA stockpiles are about 4 billion barrels, okay? Saudi oil production right now is actually on the slightly lower end historically. Sometimes it goes up to 12 million, sometimes it's down to 9. It's about 10 right now. So if the Saudis produce 10 million barrels a day, but there are 4 billion barrels in stockpiles, right? That means we get essentially 400 days of Saudi supply, right? So we could weather a complete disruption of Saudi production for an entire year just with IEA stockpiles, not counting however much oil Russia might have stockpiled because they are not a member of the IEA, or the Chinese. We believe they have about 300 million barrels stockpiled, right? So from an oil perspective, right, there is no plausible threat to Saudi Arabia that will actually, in a real way, impact the world market that can't be offset by market dynamics themselves or the supply cushions held in reserve. That's it.
Thank you so much, Rose. Jennifer, please go ahead.
Great. So My co-panelists have covered some of the internal dynamics. Will talked about how the deal would affect the power balance in the region and the implications for the United States, and Rose focused on the oil. So I'm going to look outside and think about how this deal would affect U.S. global commitments, and then also deal with the China piece. Would this actually help alleviate the threat that the U.S. feels from China's increasing influence in the Middle East? Like my co-panelists, I think that it's a bad deal for the United States on all of those dimensions. The U.S. ends up giving up a lot, taking on a lot of new responsibilities, and getting very little. So let me explain why I think that. So first, thinking a little bit about the security guarantee and what that would mean for U.S. global commitments. Rose is correct that it's very unlikely that another country in the region is going to invade or take over Saudi Arabia. So the threats that we're thinking about trying to deter and protect Saudi Arabia from, were they to get a U.S. security guarantee, would be mostly airstrikes, drone strikes, maybe some threats along the very long coastline from militant ships or Iranian ships. So in that sense, the capabilities required wouldn't be like lots of ground forces, but it would be anti-ship missiles, air defense, sensors and radars, other types of munition stockpiles that might be needed if a large sort of airstrike or air war started. And so those capabilities should sound familiar because those are the same ones that have been in the news for the past year. Things that Israel has been draining out of U.S. stockpiles, that Ukraine has been asking for, and that Taiwan needs and doesn't have because the U.S. has been allocating its stocks and its new production elsewhere. So these are already capabilities that are under strain where the U.S. doesn't have enough. And so taking on additional commitments in the region of this type would put additional strain on U.S. military readiness for what it has defined as higher priorities in the Asia-Pacific theater. So it really would put the U.S. at an even greater disadvantage in terms of its global readiness and its ability to respond to a range of different types of threats. I agree 100% with Will that it would really enmesh the United States in this region. So rather than allowing the United States to get out, it would have the opposite effect of pulling it deeper in. And it would tie itself to allies that have proven to be unreliable and risky. And so that takes on or brings on a whole new set of wartime potential and wartime risks. And these capabilities that I've mentioned would be things that would have to be in the region all the time. For deterrence purposes. They're not things you could surge forward. And if there were a conflict, as we've seen over the past 6 months, the U.S. would then have to surge more power, more naval power, more air power into the region. Again, just the types of things that we would want to keep in reserve were there to be some kind of contingency in Asia. So from that sense, from a military standpoint, it's a really bad deal, and it puts additional strain on already overstretched U.S. military. Thinking then about the China piece, and this is one of the big selling points. If you talk to people who are favorable on this deal, one of the things that they sell, the reason why these security guarantees might be useful, is that they could potentially break down or push out China, which is seen by some as a big threat as it expands its influence in Asia. There's a feeling that the United States is at risk of losing its position in the Middle East to China. So there's 2 problems with this. The first is that those assertions and assumptions are just wrong. China is certainly expanding its economic influence in the region, but it has absolutely no interest in taking on the security guarantor role that the U.S. Seems to want for some reason. And they've proven this time and time again, most recently in the Red Sea, where they've had absolutely no role in trying to keep the sea lanes open. They, when the U.S. tried to reach out to the Chinese to ask for help in terms of trying to contain or stop the Houthi strikes on global shipping, the Chinese basically made a deal with the Houthis to not strike Chinese ships, and were perfectly fine to have them strike other countries' ships. So the way in which the U.S. sees the region and the way in which the Chinese see the region, which is in a transactional way, They're just very different. So the U.S., if it wants to continue to be security guarantor, which I think, several of us of the panelists here, I think would be happy if the U.S. gave that role up. But if they want to keep it, I think it's there for the taking. Chinese are not coming to take it. The second problem is that the way that the deal goes after Chinese ties and Chinese influence in Saudi Arabia is not going to actually have the effects that the U.S. would want it to have. The first problem is that it focuses on military ties. It says no Chinese military bases in Saudi Arabia. They have to stop military training, no arms sales, restricted Chinese investment into certain tech fields that are relevant to military technology. But China has no plans to build military bases in Saudi Arabia. Their arms sales are tiny compared to U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia. And yeah, they do have some investment. So that's the one place where it could matter. But it's going to be very difficult to selectively cut China out of certain sectors and not others. And the reason for that is that, number one, like in any economy, those sectors are interlinked. And number two, Saudi Arabia doesn't have the sort of transparency that would allow us to go in and see exactly where the Chinese money and the Chinese ties are. So there's likely to be some bleed over. The only place where the new treaty would curtail Chinese activities in Saudi Arabia is mainly in the area of domestic security. So police training, surveillance technologies. That's one area where their cooperation would probably stop. But it's not going to push China out in any way. And the U.S. has tried this in other places, like UAE. They've tried to cut China out of the AI market. And so far, it's been a pretty big failure. They have done very little to limit Chinese influence, and they've created a whole new set of challenges in terms of the Chinese may actually have easier access to sensitive U.S. technologies because of the way some of these deals have been set up. And so it could lead to some kind of weird situations in Saudi Arabia. So, for example, Saudi Arabia, China owns large stakes in a number of Saudi ports. The deal wouldn't do anything to stop that. So China might not have military bases, but it might own Saudi ports and be able to use those ports for, refueling of military ships and other types of activities. So really, you're not getting at the Chinese influence piece. So, in the end, I think it's simply just not a good deal. The U.S. doesn't get that much. It takes on new commitments, and it makes a whole bunch of additional burdens for itself. And the final thing I'll say before we turn it back to you, Dan, is, when the U.S. loves to make security guarantees, but the security guarantees are made at one point in time with one set of threats and one world picture in mind. But then they endure for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, 75 years, right, with NATO. And the world changes and the security guarantee stays. And I think that's a really problematic piece of any sort of deal that has security guarantees. You can't control what's going to happen 75 years down the road, and the U.S. never cuts those security guarantees. And I think that's something really to keep in mind looking at a region that is constantly in turmoil.
Thank you, Jennifer. Will, I wanted to go to you real quick. As everybody here knows, the United States has a pretty significant, I guess you can call it unofficial, security relationship with Saudi Arabia going back to the 1940s. And the big event in my mind is during the Gulf War, when the United States sent 500,000 or so troops to essentially deter Saddam Hussein from invading Saudi Arabia's oil fields. I guess my question is why formalize that relationship now, particularly when, as Rose said, there's really no direct threat to Saudi oil fields to worry about. So what's the point of formalizing that relationship now? Is it essentially to essentially bribe Saudi Arabia to normalize relations with Israel, or am I looking at it too cynically?
No, I think you're actually right to think that, right? That this is, as I mentioned, it's kind of a way to grease the wheels of the deal. I think that the United States, kind of building upon the Abraham Accords framework of trying to generate normalization between Arab states and Israel, is so dead set in seeing normalization as the pathway towards stability that lets us leave, that they're willing to give up things like these major security commitments and guarantees to Saudi Arabia, right? And so you're right to say that the relationship's fairly close. We've provided a lot of arms and those sorts of things. It's it's obviously not official, but to me, that's the main thing, is trying to get that. Now, again, normalization of relations is a good thing. Like, I don't think we stand against that, but I just don't think it's worth it in terms of the costs that we're talking about here, that all of us have been talking about, sort of the downstream implications of that. So I think the Saudis are using this. I mean, they're very good at leveraging the United States. Jennifer mentioned the China piece. They've leveraged the China thing immensely in order to manipulate the United States partly into this kind of a deal, right? And so they're very good at that. And I think that we're getting too caught up in thinking about competing with China everywhere, right? We're way too optimistic about the potential of what normalization can produce, especially if there's not a real clear Palestinian state pathway forward to create the real deep kind of peace that's needed in order to settle the conflict there and to really change the dynamics of the region. So I just would say that, yeah, I think to your point, it's right. I mean, it's mostly to grease the wheels of this thing. And I think it's unfortunate in a sense that's where we sort of landed with this.
Rose, Will's point of moral hazard, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman doesn't strike me as a very cautious man. And you can go back, and that's probably putting it mildly. You can go back through a list of decisions he made, particularly during his first few years as defense minister and crown prince, whether it's the embargo of Qatar, whether it's the operations in Yemen that pretty much proved to be counterproductive and hurt the kingdom's reputation worldwide. That all happened without an official U.S. security guarantee. So to what extent do you think, on Will's point of moral hazard, do you think the Saudis would be emboldened and take more action like that, knowing that they have like a superpower protector in their back pocket?
Oh, I think it's no question that it would embolden them. It almost always does. I would add to the list of sort of egregious risks / offenses that the Saudis have done in recent years would be the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, right? The reporter in Turkey, right? Whenever you have a situation where you as a country or as a person are not fully responsible for the consequences of your own actions because you have someone protecting you, right? It just makes you do things that are riskier. It makes you do things that are, or allows you to do things that, that maybe if prudence reigned, you wouldn't do, right? Now, I don't know exactly what MBS has in mind for the future, but especially given the fact that we have so little benefit from having this relationship at all, right? Why do we want to tell the Saudis, hey, it's cool. We've got your back no matter what you do. We've given you the security guarantee. And like Jennifer said, I think it's an excellent point. It's not like we ever rescind these guarantees, right? Once you give the guarantee, there's then all these arguments about credibility, right? Well, if you take away the guarantee, then nobody will believe in American credibility, right? So once you've got that guarantee, it's like if you have a kid and they know they have a trust fund, right? This is a security guarantee. It's not a trust fund, but they have no reason to go out and make money or become responsible citizens because they know they've always got this trust fund to sort of fall back on, right? The Saudis know they will always have this American security guarantee to fall back on, always, right? And that's just not good for anyone. It's probably not good for Saudi Arabia either if it encourages them to take risks that just aren't in their own interest, right?
Jennifer, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I think the one thing I would add is, two things actually. The first is, I think that this is a trend, right? The U.S. loves giving security guarantees. Think about all the countries that we've talked about, giving security guarantees. There's some who argue that Ukraine should be added to NATO. Everyone was very excited when Sweden and Finland joined NATO. There's some people who argue that we should extend a formal guarantee to Taiwan. There's some people who say that we should be talking to Vietnam about security guarantees, right? So I think because the U.S. has such a big, powerful military, security guarantees is something that seems or has historically seemed low cost because it was very rarely challenged. But that's not the world that we live in now. Like, these things are challenged, and these things pose risks, and resources are finite. So I think that mentality needs to shift. The second thing is that, this guarantee with the Saudis is being framed in some contexts as a mutual defense agreement. And I think it's important to dispel the notion that, like, the Saudis would be defending U.S. interests in the region, like if U.S. regions were U.S. soldiers were attacked. We've seen very clearly that that's not the role the Saudis play. We've seen it in the Red Sea. They've contributed very little, although their interests are much more at stake than ours. They have not done much to help protect U.S. forces in the region. So, I mean, I think that's a very important point. And just to the point of moral hazard, the Saudis have received billions in U.S. weapons and training, and yet they're still unable to defend themselves. So clearly, like, this, having the U.S. there, I can't believe that that's not playing a role in the reason why we're not seeing a translation between all this material and all this training and actual, like, competence in their own military operations.
Jennifer, I wanted to stick with you, on the military aspects. You kind of spoke about this briefly during your opening remarks, but what exactly would be required to, assuming this deal goes through and the United States does in fact formalize a security relationship with Saudi Arabia, what military assets would be required to basically sustain that arrangement over the long term? And would it kind of thin out or put added stress on America's global force posture, particularly in East Asia, where the Biden administration and even the Trump administration kind of ostensibly viewed that region as a strategic priority?
Well, we already right now have so much military force posture in the region because of the escalating violence that I think one of the biggest things is that a lot of those increases would become permanent. So a lot of the increased naval presence, I think, would have to be permanent, because you'd have to keep the naval power offshore as sort of a signal that the U.S. was committed. I think you'd have to see, probably we've like doubled our U.S. air power in the region over the past year. I think that would have to stay, although you could see a migration of some of that to Saudi bases. Away, right now it's not. I mean, we historically have had presence in Saudi Arabia. Right now, our presence in Saudi Arabia is rather small. So that would probably increase. You'd have to add more air defenses. We do have a lot of air defense in the region, but I think you'd have to see an increase in those air defenses, specifically in Saudi Arabia. As I said, I think munitions stockpiles is a big one because any sort of conflict is likely to involve airstrikes or strikes from sea. We've drained those stockpiles significantly in the Middle East. Against the Houthis, just last night they used a B-2 bomber against the Houthis, which is, that's a different conversation than we're having today. But so we already see ways in which the Biden administration came in saying that Asia was the priority, and yet we're seeing all these capabilities: air power, naval power, long-range strike munitions that are being used in the theater that was, in theory, the least important. And it does matter. U.S. stockpiles are not unlimited. I'm not going to say that U.S. stockpiles are like drained to no missiles now. But they are not. Are not unlimited, and production is slow. So for a lot of these missiles, production rates for a lot of missiles are below 1,000 a year. And an air bombing campaign can use several hundred munitions. So, you're burning through at a rapid rate. And then you have Ukraine, who has received a lot of munition, and you have Israel, who has received a lot of munitions, and you have Taiwan, who's still waiting for, 20 billion or something in backlogged orders. So I do think that, that you will start to see real strain, especially in the munitions area, especially in air and naval power. even air and naval power that's not being used. By being deployed for so long, there's wear and tear that has to be fixed. A lot of these deployments in the Middle East have already been extended past their end date. And then the other big gap is air defense. Not only the systems, which we don't have enough of, but the interceptor missiles. There's just simply a global shortage. The U.S. cannot produce enough to defend Ukraine, to help Israel defend itself, to give Asian allies and partners the air defense they need, and to make sure U.S. forces have enough air defense. The Secretary of the Army has admitted in public forums that right now the Army does not have the air defense capacity it would need to support the way the military plans to fight in Asia. So, I mean, these gaps already exist, and this conflict would only add another source of another drain on them, even in peacetime, even if they were no conflict.
Dan, can I hop in on that real quickly?
Of course.
Yeah, just to sort of piggyback real quickly on what Jennifer says and come back to the prior point about commitments. I think to reinforce what she's talking about, some people may say, well, sure, again, we can do this on the cheap, right? We don't need to send all of that sort of thing. But I think what you have to realize here is that while the United States has been, yes, as Jennifer mentioned, I think she's exactly right on this, but we sort of give away security commitments like handing out Halloween candy or something like that. These commitments are of a different order and of a different nature, right? I mean, the commitments we're talking about here are collective defense agreements. We've not entered one of these since 1960 with Japan during the Cold War, right? So this is, and they aren't quite NATO commitments, but they're pretty darn close. And, that will inevitably require the resources that Jennifer's talking about, right? I mean, it's because of these are some of our highest level commitments. We don't have any commitments like this outside of Turkey in the Middle East, North Africa, or South Asia, right? So we shouldn't underplay how significant the pledges are that the United States is getting into here.
Yeah, and I would just say that what I was outlining in terms of capabilities, like I would consider that to be like bare bones. Like that is the cheap option. There is a more expensive way to do it, but I think it would be unnecessary given some of the reasons, some of the things that Rose mentioned about, just the lack of like a credible threat. And, right now the largest threat comes from Iran, and that's not going to be a ground invasion. So, I mean, I've been wrong about the Middle East before, so I shouldn't say anything for sure. But I would be shocked if Iran tried a ground invasion of Saudi Arabia.
I think it's pretty safe to say that everybody's been wrong about the Middle East before. So.
Yeah, that's right.
Rose, on the oil aspect, my understanding is that the United States does not import much Saudi oil anymore. I think it's only the last figures I saw was something like, I believe, like 60% decline over the last decade or something in terms of U.S. imports. I know oil is a global commodity, so we still have to worry about price. But, to what extent does oil kind of drive this decision-making in Washington, do you think?
Yeah.
If it does.
Yeah. Well, so, I mean, historically, it certainly did. And, the point about oil being a global market is a huge one. And it's one that lots of people don't really understand, right? So it's, right now, the U.S. is basically sort of break even / net exporter of oil, right? Because we've had the shale oil boom since 2014. So for the past 10 years or so. But, it's all going into this one giant market. It's a commodity. It's fungible. There's one global price for it. And so it doesn't really matter how much you're producing domestically. And it doesn't really matter where you get your oil from. It's super cheap to transport it. So if one country was selling you oil and then suddenly for some reason they don't, you turn around and buy it from somebody else. And it's a really sort of simple way of adapting, right? That adjustment just sort of happens every day, right? Just on its own through market forces. In terms of, Saudi oil and its importance, like it's been important historically for two main reasons, right? One is just the amount that they produce. They're one of the largest producers. We are as big or bigger now than they are. And so if there's some sort of threat that disrupts that oil going to market, there's less oil in the market and prices go up for everybody, regardless of if they ever buy Saudi oil or not, right? that's one reason. Now we have, stockpiles to deal with that issue, right? The other reason that people think Saudi is special from an oil perspective is that they are the only country historically that's maintained spare capacity of 1.5 to maybe 2 million barrels a day. And the thinking is, okay, so Saudi is this like swing producer, and maybe if the U.S. like makes nice to the Saudis, we can lean on them to produce more oil at times when prices are high. It's not at all clear that the Saudis listen to us when we ask them to expand oil output. They really don't seem to, right? Because they don't really have to. They also don't single-handedly control oil market prices. And there's also been this development in the past 10 years, the shale oil boom, that makes that swing producer capability even less important, right? It's partly less important because we have this giant cushion that we can draw on from strategic petroleum reserves in the US and elsewhere. But historically, oil is the kind of thing that it takes a long time to ramp up new production, right? It just takes a long time to explore, to drill, to, build the pipes from the field to wherever they're going. And so if prices went up, it would take years for the market to catch up, right, to adjust. Now with shale oil, the adjustment period is much quicker, right? Within a few months, shale producers can start producing at higher rates. And that's the oil that's being produced from the United States, right? So this new oil, this unconventional oil as opposed to conventional oil, is just much more adaptable to changing market conditions, which again, sort of undermines this whole idea that the Saudis are an important swing producer, that they're the only important swing producer, right? The US doesn't centrally control all of these actors. They just sort of do it according to market conditions, right? So if something happened that made oil prices go up, shale producers in the United States would start pumping out more shale oil pretty quickly without any government directive to do so, right? And so, I don't know what people in Washington are thinking. I look at this and I really scratch my head and think, like, why do they even care about Saudi oil at all? Right? There are a lot of times that I look at what the U.S. is doing and it's just like, what are they thinking? But I have to think that this is a major reason why we care and why we have this relationship, right? It's not based on them being a democracy with similar values to us, right? So if that's it, then why are we doing this, right? Why are we allied with them informally at all? And why are we even considering, putting a ring on it and making it official till death do us part?
Well, I think when most Americans think of security guarantees or a security relationship, they kind of assume it's, number one, it's necessary. Number two, even if it isn't necessary, it would serve some sort of U.S. interest, whether it's, maintaining a stable balance of power in the region or keeping a swing producer close, kind of under the American tent. But your paper that I think is going to be released pretty shortly, it kind of talks in a very convincing way about how it's actually the exact opposite. How this could actually introduce more turbulence and mess up a relatively stable balance of power in the region, and convince Iran to do certain things that we may not want them to do. I wonder if you could kind of expand upon that. And what you think on that front.
Yeah, I mean, I think on that, I'll start with the last point just about Iran and what we have right now. I mean, there's some talk about how this particular grand bargain, this deal, will somehow, and it'll not just normalize Israeli-Saudi relations, it will actually somehow tighten up their alliance in certain ways that will make them sort of more robust in their deterrence of Iran, or increase their cooperation. But their cooperation is already quite deep and quite expansive and significant. This goes back a long ways. They've been able to sort of coordinate quite effectively. So it's not really super clear to me how, again, that particular benefit, so-called benefit of the deal, I don't think is really much of a benefit at all, right? But again, coming back to sort of my opening comments, what I think it does do is that it, in some ways, it kind of, you have something of a balance that exists right now that prevents the region from exploding from one side, sort of going rogue to the point that we're going to see this major escalation to war. Now, I still think we could see that, right? I mean, there's still severe dangers of that right now with the existing circumstances. I think that the potential for that becomes even worse once you, again, tip the balance here by the United States really putting its finger on the scale even more substantially than it does right now. Okay, right? So the consequence of that, I mentioned the moral hazard piece, right? That it's going to kind of solidify that with Israel, essentially allowing Israel to continue to pursue some policies that are pretty reckless, and then to sort of enhance that as well with Saudi Arabia. So those are two things that I worry about. I didn't mention this. I think the deal, because of the way that it will amp up tension in the region, will also reduce the United States' diplomatic leverage to manage conflict, right? So the United States, for instance, has kind of a tacit agreement right now that the Biden administration, we don't know a whole lot about it, was able to sort of broker with Iran, when the JCPOA, sort of the additional negotiations broke down for them not to proliferate. Well, again, I think that falls apart. And I think the United States was able to use some back channel diplomatic leverage to sort of encourage the Iranians this spring, for instance, in their first response to Israel, their first military attack, to sort of tone that down some. Again, I think we lose a lot of that leverage by putting our finger on the scale of conflict, right? So it's not just the balance, it's the way that it affects diplomacy. And I think the United States will also lose leverage with its allies, Israel and Saudi Arabia, right? For all the moral hazard we've seen with Israel, the United States has been fortunate enough to figure out a way to at least temper some of those responses, as we're seeing this week, apparently with the announcement that it's only going to hit Iranian military targets instead of its oil or nuclear facilities. I think we lose some of that leverage with the grand bargain because, again, they know that we're solidly behind them. We have their back, not just with Israel, but with Saudi Arabia as well. So it's those kind of subtle mechanisms that maybe we're not thinking through well enough here. And my explainers, I'm trying to bring that to light a little bit to get us to think a little bit about that.
Jennifer, in your foreign affairs piece, you kind of talk about the China angle, how a lot of this is about packaging the Middle East sort of into its Indo-Pacific strategy. In other words, we need to do this because it would ice out China in the region and undermine its activities in the Persian Gulf. I guess, you hear a lot about that. Obviously, in Washington, you've heard a lot about it for years now. Is that something we really have to worry about? Is China seeking to displace the United States in the region as some sort of security guarantor? Because that seems to be the assumption. Do you buy that?
I absolutely not. I mean, I see absolutely no evidence of that. China's military presence in the Middle East is very small. There's maybe one potential base in UAE. And even that is sort of very nascent and hard to say exactly what it is. But they don't really do very much military training. Their main security activity in the region is training of police forces and support to domestic security. So they are big on selling like domestic surveillance technologies. The biggest tie that China has to a lot of these countries is the shared authoritarian outlook. And so there is some evidence that they've tried to proliferate that, or at least take advantage of that shared approach to domestic control, for lack of a better term, for their economic gains. But China's a transactional player. They're really only in it if it's a win-win, right? That's the China's big thing is they want win-win relationships. So they've invested heavily in infrastructure. They're interested in tech opportunities. They're heavily involved in the energy markets because they are very dependent on Middle Eastern oil for their survival. Those are their primary interests, and they will secure those interests. And that's the main reason why they are active in the region. And still, their military presence is very small, right? Like you would think that China would have been much more concerned about the Houthi strikes than the United States was, given their dependence on that trade route for their oil. So China has seen the U.S. failures in the Middle East in terms of all the wars that it's been dragged into. They're very happy to have the U.S. keep playing that role because it keeps them tied up and distracted. And all the resources that the United States might be currently allocating and storing up for a contingency in Asia are now being drained away in the Middle East. But there's just really, I think the idea that China is going to swoop in and become this new security guarantor is wrong, not only because the United States has not actually pulled out, like there is no vacuum, but also because China just hasn't stepped up. China doesn't really have the capabilities to project power to the Middle East. They have, deployed their aircraft carriers, but they've shown no evidence of their ability to operate abroad, far away from Chinese shores. They have that one base in Djibouti, but it's very small. It's focused mostly on piracy. So there's just no evidence there to support this idea that China is coming to swoop in. Now, China's economic influence in the region is growing. But again, to me, it's not zero sum. They're expanding in areas where the U.S. is not. And they're not doing it to push the U.S. out. They're doing it because the countries in the region want that. The countries in the region like Saudi Arabia and UAE are not interested in choosing sides. They're interested in diversity. They're working with Russia. They're working with China. They're working with the United States. They're working with India. They are benefiting from increasing an increasingly multipolar world. And as Will said, they're playing China and the United States and Russia off each other. They're exploiting this fear that the U.S. has of being displaced.
Rose, I'd like to get your take on the China oil question too, because there's no question China relies extensively on the Persian Gulf oil to power its economy, which, let's face it, the economy is not as good today as it was several years ago. So what do you think about all this?
Yeah. So, I sort of say to China, right, and I say it facetiously, but kind of not really, if they want to take over the role as regional security provider, like have at it, right? This has brought the United States grief for 25 years, right? For 35 years, if you go back to the Persian Gulf, the first Persian Gulf War. But, I think it's worth zooming out and sort of thinking about like, what's the benefit of having a regional security provider, right? The benefit of having a regional security provider, we assume, is that it helps prevent conflicts from going so crazy that it screws up oil prices in some way, right? That's sort of the main reason, I think, why the U.S. cares about being a security provider in the Middle East. And it's why we think, well, China's getting a bunch of oil from the Middle East. Maybe it's why they want to be a security provider, right? I'm not convinced that our security actually keeps conflict in the region down, right? If you want low oil prices, you want less conflict in the region. So is our security keeping regional conflict down? It's hard to say that it is, right? And it's especially not going to if we basically tell each of these countries, Israel, but Saudi especially, hey, it's cool. We've got your back no matter what you do, right? That is going to encourage adventurism. That's going to encourage risk taking. That's going to make conflict that causes potential price spikes much more likely, right? Now, I don't think those price spikes are actually as bad as people think they are, but that's ostensibly the reason that we're there. And if you want to keep regional actors in check, you want to prevent them from going berserk and making oil prices go up, then you don't want to give them a security guarantee that encourages reckless behavior.
Thank you so much. We're coming out about 5 minutes until the top of the hour. So this will be our last question. I want to hear from all three of you because I think this is a very important kind of anchor to the discussion. Well, first, do you think the deal, the so-called Israel-Saudi U.S. mega deal, do you think it's actually going to come to fruition? That's number one. Number two, if you don't, what would the alternative be? What should the United States focus on instead in terms of its core interest in the region? Will, why don't we go with you first, and then Rose, and then Jennifer, you can close it out for us.
So I think that I think there's still potential. The deal that I don't, this deal doesn't get done during the Biden administration. I can't see that happening, right? I mean, we're so far away from, I mean, especially with Lebanon and Gaza and everything else, and where the Israelis are on the two-state solution, we're still a long ways away. But I do think the idea of the deal lives on beyond this administration. I mean, the Trump administration, President Trump from before sort of illustrated with the Abraham Accords, right? I think he loved the idea of being that transformational. I started the Afghan pullout. Even though he doesn't really want to take credit for it, we did the Abraham Accords. Want to build upon that. So he likes big deals. So I think the Trump administration is going to be attracted to this. It's kind of it would be a building on what they've done. So I think they're going to try. I think that the Harris administration, to shift the playing field, might try as well, right? And there are going to be people probably, if there is a Harris administration, who would support that, who would transition from Biden right into the Harris administration. I think there could be some personnel that would be supported. I think it's going to be really hard to get done. My fear is that they do it without necessary progress on the Palestinian issue. And if they do it, then they are opening the door to real chaos in the region. So I just think you're going to increase conflict and those sorts of things. Just real quickly, if it doesn't happen, I think the United States, as I mentioned sort of at the end of my opening comments, probably really just needs to do a major rethink of its alliance commitments here, especially perhaps with Israel, and not so much to terminate the alliance. That's not what I'm arguing for, but I would just arguing for making the alliance more ambiguous. Let's use the Taiwan model, where we actually gain back control of the alliance relationship, because I think we've lost control of it. We've especially seen that since 10/7. So, and I just would say that we shouldn't be making any kind of collective security guarantees to Saudi Arabia for all of the reasons that that Jennifer and Rose have really picked up on here in particular.
Rose, please go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Will the deal happen or not? I mean, this is the kind of thing I always get wrong. I feel like there's a 50-50 chance, of getting it wrong, because I could say yes or no. But at this point, it looks pretty far away, given that the current deal, part of it is this, real commitment to a Palestinian state. And it does not seem like that is something that's going to happen anytime soon, given the dynamics currently ongoing. It might depend on the administration that comes in. If Trump comes in and is more willing to sort of jettison the Palestine issue, maybe it's more likely that it could happen. Unclear. But ultimately, I think the U.S. needs to try to find ways to pull back, clearly, to pull back, not to get more involved. And, I'll just pose sort of the question, or put the thought out there, right? Like oil, I think it's undeniable that oil is a major reason why we care about the Middle East at all, why we care about Saudi Arabia for sure, right? What if instead of investing all this money, we actually thought about trying to decrease our dependence on oil, period, right? We know we need to do that for climate change purposes. We know that there's this ongoing decarbonization, right? The Biden administration has put a huge amount of money in the Inflation Reduction Act towards the green energy transition, towards making that happen. But I don't see a sort of corresponding understanding that, okay, well, if we do the green energy thing, then we don't need to care as much about the Middle East, right? There is a sort of, complementary, or I don't know, maybe supplementary, let's take that money, let's take that investment and put it towards the green energy transition, right? It's not about how much oil we get from the Saudi Arabians. It's about how much oil we use, period, no matter where it comes from. And the sooner we decrease our dependence on oil, simply for climate reasons, the sooner we can get out of the Middle East, right? Those are reinforcing rationales to leave.
Thank you. Jennifer.
So like Will and Rose, I don't see it being likely in the near term because of the Israeli-Palestinian issue. In fact, MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, has went even further recently to say that it wasn't just a pathway to a Palestinian state, it was an actual Palestinian state that he wanted. So even if Trump is willing to punt on the Palestinian issue, or Harris administration is willing to punt on that, at least right now, I think the dynamics among Arab states, just in terms of public opinion, whether maybe not at the elite level, but the public opinion would just be intolerant of that. So I think that's a barrier. But this deal is really like a zombie. It keeps coming back. So I'm not willing to declare it dead yet. In terms of what the U.S. should do instead, I mean, to me, the Abraham Accords are really just a U.S. effort to build a new security bloc in the Middle East. There's always this infatuation with trying to like rewrite the Middle East or have like the new face of the Middle East. And really, I think the U.S. should get out of that. Like, I don't find security blocs usually where conflict erupts is on the edges of security blocks. So to me, that's sort of a way to guarantee future conflicts in the region. The U.S., in my view, has very few interests in the region that can be accomplished with military presence. And the U.S. should really be focused on getting out, downsizing its commitments, removing forces, removing hardware, not flowing it into the theater as we're doing now, and letting the region figure out what it wants its future security architecture to look like. And there have been efforts, Saudi Arabia and other countries have been reaching out to Iran themselves and trying to broker, new agreements. And I think the U.S. should be in the role of empowering and pushing its partners in the region to do those things, and to focus on the other drivers of conflict in the region that need to be solved. Things like the energy future, alternative energies, climate change. Like, these are issues that these countries need to deal with and that are going to drive conflicts in the future. So really, I would, I'm not saying, pull out and, leave them holding the bag like tomorrow, but that should be the long-term goal. And that should be the focus of the next administration in the Middle East, is how do we actually get out and turn this responsibility for the security of this region over to the countries in this region?
Will Waldorf, Rose Kalanick, Jennifer Kavanaugh, thank you so much for joining us. It was a very interesting discussion, and I'm going to be thinking about this for the rest of the day, just FYI. And I want to thank everybody for tuning in. And please be aware that Defense Priorities has plenty of events and papers and op-eds and all those good stuff in the pipeline. So be on the lookout for that. Thank you so much. Bye.